At 2:17 in the morning, Everett Lawson woke to his private dock, burning from end to end, every plank his late father had ever touched, turning to ash. By sunrise, the HOA president Marjorie Voss stood smiling behind the police tape, calling it an unfortunate accident. She had no idea Everett's hidden camera had already caught her own maintenance crew pouring fuel and cutting the water line before the first flame. And she had no idea that the ground beneath that dock was federally protected, hiding a secret about to bring the whole HOA down with her. The lake itself had always been the one constant in Everett's life, unchanged, since childhood summers spent casting lines off the same pilings that now lay in ruin, and the water that night carried the reflection of flames the way it once carried the reflection of fireworks on quiet holiday evenings. Neighbors who arrived to watch would later say the smoke smelled unlike ordinary wood smoke, sharper and more chemical, though none of them thought much of it, until investigators explained why weeks later. Everett was 43 years old, a structural engineer by trade, and a quiet man by nature. He had spent his career designing bridges and retaining walls for a regional firm 2 counties away, work that had trained him to notice the smallest inconsistency in a load calculation or a survey line, a skill that would matter more in the coming weeks than any of his neighbors could have guessed. He lived alone in the lake house his father had left him, a property that predated the Cedar Ridge Estates development by nearly 2 decades, which meant he had never been a member of the homeowners association that governed every other lot along the water. He understood property lines, permits, and load-bearing joints, the way other men understood their own hands, and his greatest strength was not size or temper but patience, the discipline to gather proof before he ever raised his voice. Colleagues who had worked with him for years often said he could sit through an entire meeting without speaking, only to ask one question at the very end that unraveled everyone else's assumptions. The dock that burned that night was the last thing he and his father had built together, plank by plank, over 3 long summers, and losing it felt less like property damage and more like losing a conversation that could never be finished. He ran outside barefoot, dialed the fire department, and tried to reach the emergency pump housed near the shoreline, only to find the fuel line had been severed clean. The fire spread across the wood decking, swallowed the tool shed, and consumed the restored boat. He had spent 3 years repairing, and all Everett could do was stand at the edge of the yard and watch the last physical trace of his father collapse into the water. The fire chief, a careful, unhurried man named Nolan Briggs, arrived with his crew and immediately noticed 3 separate points of ignition along the deck, a pattern that did not match a simple electrical fault, though he said nothing about it in front of the gathering crowd. When the sun came up, Marjorie appeared at the edge of the property in tailored clothes, telling the neighbors that Everett had repeatedly refused to upgrade the dock's old wiring, a claim Everett had never heard from anyone since no inspection notice had ever reached his mailbox. She offered sympathy with one hand and with the other, mentioned that the association would be happy to help clear the wreckage if Everett would simply sign over a 99-year easement along his waterfront. The offer came far too quickly, polished and rehearsed, and it told Everett everything he needed to know. Whatever had happened that night had been planned long before the first match was struck. Later that morning, sifting through the ash near where the tool shed had stood, Everett found a wrench blackened by heat, his father's initials still faintly visible, where they had been carved into the handle decades earlier. He did not cry in front of the onlookers gathering along the road, but his hand closed around the metal until his knuckles split. He made himself a private promise, standing there in the wreckage he would not act out of anger. He would let the people responsible walk directly into the proof of their own making. That evening, when the crowd had finally thinned and the fire trucks had pulled away, Everett climbed the ladder to the camera, mounted high in the pine, and found the memory card still intact inside its housing. The first clip he opened showed a maintenance truck bearing the Cedar Ridge Estates logo, turning into the gravel lane at 1:43 in the morning, its headlights sweeping briefly across the dark water before the engine cut off. He did this at his kitchen table before dawn, coffee untouched beside him, hands steady even though his chest still ached from watching everything burn a few hours earlier, because he had learned from his father that grief could wait, but proof could not. Everett copied the footage onto 3 separate hard drives and 1 encrypted cloud account before he did anything else, because he understood that evidence which existed in only one place could always disappear. He did not call the police that first night, not because he doubted what he had seen, but because the footage shot from 60 meters away through branches and shifting light showed shapes rather than faces, movement rather than proof. In the video, 3 figures in maintenance jackets unloaded metal cans from the truck bed. One moved toward the water pump, a second toward the electrical panel at the base of the dock, and the third began pouring liquid along the length of the decking in slow, deliberate passes. Something about the third figure's gait, the particular way his left shoulder dipped with each step, was familiar to Everett, and after a sleepless hour of replaying the clip, he recognized Wade Mercer, the association's maintenance manager, a man who had waved to him from that same truck 100 times before. The next morning brought a notice taped to Everett's mailbox, informing him that the burned remains of his dock constituted a violation of the community's aesthetic standards and demanding he clear the debris within 72 hours or face a fine of $1,000 per day. Everett wrote back calmly, and in writing that the association held no jurisdiction over land that had never belonged to it, and Marjorie responded within hours with a new boundary map, one that showed the association's territory extending well past his shoreline and directly through the ruins of his dock. The map bore almost no resemblance to the county's original survey, and Everett recognized immediately that whoever had drawn it had been planning this move for a very long time. Delaney had grown up 2 towns over, had known Everett's father slightly through a mutual client decades earlier, and had always found something quietly admirable in the way the old man kept every receipt, every permit, every letter he had ever exchanged with the county, a habit he had passed down to his son without either of them ever discussing it directly. He called Delaney Price, a land use attorney who had once reviewed his family's title work years earlier and knew the property's history as well as anyone alive. After laying the 2 maps side by side, Delaney confirmed what Everett already suspected: the boundary had been altered. The recording stamp mimicked a real county seal, but referenced a file number that did not exist in any registry. She urged him to stay off the property line entirely and to avoid confronting Marjorie directly, warning that a forged map paired with a suspicious fire suggested something far larger than a simple property dispute, something closer to a coordinated attempt to force him off his own land. Meanwhile, Nolan's preliminary findings pointed to accelerant residue at multiple points along the burned decking, evidence that should have opened a criminal arson investigation within days. Instead, his supervisor quietly instructed him to hold the report pending further verification, a delay that made no procedural sense unless someone with influence had made a call. Everett began to suspect that Marjorie's reach inside the county extended further than a homeowners association president should, and that reach was already working to slow down the truth before it could reach a courtroom. At the next scheduled meeting, Marjorie stood before a packed room and announced that Everett had likely staged the fire himself to collect insurance money, and that the board intended to hold a vote seizing his waterfront on the grounds, that it now posed a hazard to the community. Everett attended but said nothing about the footage. Instead, he simply asked in a calm and level voice why an association maintenance truck had been recorded moving through the neighborhood at nearly 2 a.m. on the night of the fire. The room went silent, and Marjorie, recovering quickly, claimed the truck had been parked in the maintenance yard all night and challenged him to prove otherwise if he could. When Everett returned home that evening, he discovered the original memory card missing from the drawer where he had left it, though nothing else in the house had been disturbed. No lock forced, no window broken, which told him whoever had taken it possessed a key or an old maintenance code that should never have still worked. On the kitchen table sat a folded slip of paper in handwriting he did not recognize. The dock was only the first warning. He changed every lock in the house that same night, installed new cameras with independent storage, and filed a police report for the break-in, though the responding officer logged it with visible reluctance as a civil dispute rather than a crime. Delaney spent the following days at the county records office tracing the origin of the forged boundary map and found an electronic filing uploaded 6 months earlier, one claiming the association had purchased management rights to the entire northern shoreline, complete with a signature attributed to Everett Lawson. The signature was not his. The filing listed a payment of $480,000 that Everett had never received, wired instead to a company calling itself Shoreline Renewal Partners. A business Delaney soon discovered had been founded by Marjorie's own brother-in-law and appeared to employ no actual staff. He remembered attending that original proposal meeting with his father, remembered the way Marjorie had smiled through the rejection, and promised the board would revisit the matter someday, when circumstances were more favorable, a promise that had sounded harmless at the time, and now felt like the opening line of a plan set in motion years before the first spark ever touched the dock. Everett remembered then that the association had once proposed building a private yacht club, a restaurant, and 24 premium boat slips along that very stretch of water, a plan rejected years earlier for lack of lawful access to the shoreline. If Marjorie could seize his land through a forged transfer, she could sell development rights to a resort company for a sum that would dwarf anything the association's dues had ever generated. Everett and Delaney tracked down a former board member named Franklin Moss, a man who had resigned in protest after Marjorie pushed through a special assessment supposedly meant to protect the lake's ecosystem, an assessment that had raised more than $1,600,000 over 3 years, without funding a single visible project. Franklin met Everett and Delaney at a small diner off the county highway, choosing a booth far from the windows out of habit more than necessity, and spoke in the careful tone of a man who had spent years learning what happened to people who crossed Marjorie Voss. He described board meetings where dissent was met not with debate but with veiled reminders about how easily a home inspection could turn up a violation and how easily a violation could turn into a lien. Franklin also remembered something else. Wade had once been sent to survey Everett's dock and quietly note which sections would catch fire fastest, a request Wade had described at the time as routine maintenance planning. Buried in the paperwork Everett's father had kept for decades, Delaney found a federal environmental assessment showing that part of the dock sat within a protected wetland corridor tied to a migratory bird breeding ground, meaning any demolition, burning, or chemical discharge in that exact location could fall under federal jurisdiction rather than county authority alone. This was no longer simply property damage. If the accelerant used to burn the dock had run off into protected water, the case had just grown far beyond anything a local courtroom could resolve. That same week, Nolan asked Everett to meet him quietly at the fire station away from prying eyes and handed him a sealed bag containing a scorched fragment of fabric recovered from the wreckage, still bearing the faint outline of the Cedar Ridge Maintenance logo. Nolan's voice dropped as he explained that someone above him had just ordered every remaining physical sample from the fire destroyed before the week was out. An order that made no sense unless someone wanted the evidence gone before it could ever reach a lab. Word of the confrontation at the meeting spread quickly through the neighborhood, and within days Everett noticed a shift in how people looked at him at the mailbox at the small grocery store near the entrance to the development in the Praipan. Careful way conversations ended whenever he approached. Marjorie escalated quickly, filing a formal complaint, accusing Everett of polluting the lake building, an unpermitted dock, and threatening association members, using the very wreckage her own people had created to justify suspending his rights to the shoreline entirely. County inspectors arrived and ordered Everett not to touch the site effectively, freezing him out of his own property and preventing any repair or salvage work while the complaint moved through review. Association crews erected a temporary fence across the access road to the water, claiming the closure was a safety measure under the board's authority. Though the road itself sat on land the association had never owned. Everett removed the fence from his own property but filmed the entire process to protect himself from any accusation of vandalism, a precaution that proved necessary when Marjorie edited the footage, posted it to the community bulletin, and accused him of defying a lawful order and behaving dangerously toward his neighbors. Several residents began avoiding him on the street, while others sent quiet messages admitting they believed him but feared the fines and liens the board had used against dissenters before. Delaney filed an emergency motion, asking the court to bar the association from interfering with Everett's property. But Marjorie countered with the forged map and the fraudulent transfer agreement, and because the filings appeared legitimate in the county's electronic system, the judge granted both sides 10 days to establish the document's true origin, a delay that left Marjorie believing she had already won. Rather than release the footage of the fire itself, Everett sent the association a formal request demanding maintenance vehicle logs, fuel receipts, GPS records, Wade's work schedule, board meeting minutes concerning the shoreline project, and any contract involving shoreline renewal partners. Marjorie refused, insisting the records were private, a refusal that gave Delaney exactly the grounds she needed to ask the court to order the association to preserve all its data before anything more could vanish. That same night, Everett noticed smoke rising from behind the maintenance building where several file boxes were already burning in a metal drum in the yard. He filmed from the public road and called Nolan immediately, and when the fire chief arrived, Wade insisted they were only disposing of outdated paperwork, a claim that fell apart the moment a half-burned sheet blew loose over the fence and landed at Everett's feet. It was an invoice for 12 drums of industrial fuel paid for out of association funds on the very afternoon before the dock burned. And when Delaney traced the account number listed on that invoice, she found it filed under a project code labeled the Lawson Dock Removal, dated before the fire had ever occurred. Delaney assembled everything into a single case file: the footage, the fuel invoice, the forged map, the wetland report, and the preliminary accelerant findings, and rather than hand it to local authorities who had already shown reluctance, she forwarded it to federal investigators who handled environmental crime and financial fraud, flagging the suspicious wire transfers moving through the association's bank accounts. Special Agent Celeste Harrow contacted Everett soon after, though she made no promises and offered no reassurance, asking only that he recount everything from the beginning without speculation, without exaggeration, and without leaving out any detail, however small. Celeste had spent nearly 2 decades investigating financial crimes, disguised as ordinary local governance, and she had long ago learned that the smaller the organization, the more brazen its leaders tended to become, convinced that nobody with real authority would ever bother looking their way. She listened to Everett for nearly 3 hours that first afternoon, taking notes in a plain notebook rather than on a laptop, occasionally circling back to ask the same question from a different angle, testing his account for the kind of inconsistency that separated the truth from a story someone had rehearsed. She was particularly interested in the storage locker at the far end of the dock, and when Everett mentioned that he had once kept backup copies of water sample results, their results showing rising chemical levels near the association's drainage outlet, her interest sharpened considerably. He had planned to report those findings to the state environmental office, but had never gotten the chance before the fire destroyed the samples along with everything else. Celeste suspected the fire had served two purposes at once, seizing valuable shoreline, and simultaneously erasing evidence that the association's maintenance yard had been discharging something into the lake for years. Federal technicians quietly collected sediment from beneath the collapsed dock and found both accelerant residue and traces of a banned industrial solvent, the kind never meant to reach open water. Financial records showed the association had received a federal grant of $620,000 intended to upgrade its stormwater drainage system, yet no new system had ever been built. Most of that money had instead flowed into three companies connected to Marjorie Wade and the association's treasurer, Laurel Keene. Celeste asked Everett to keep behaving as though he were only pursuing a civil case, warning that if Marjorie learned a federal investigation was underway, she and her allies would destroy evidence or disappear entirely. Everett agreed, though the silence cost him. Without any public defense, many of his neighbors assumed he was simply losing. There were nights during those weeks when he sat alone on the porch steps overlooking the burned foundation, wondering whether patience was actually strategy or simply a comfortable word for helplessness. But he thought of his father's habit of keeping every document in order and reminded himself that the truth properly assembled rarely needed to shout. Marjorie seized the moment, holding a small press event to announce that the association would take over the burned shoreline for environmental restoration, unveiling architectural renderings of a $7.5 million yacht club that, as Celeste's team later confirmed, had already been drafted 4 months before the fire ever started. Working from a quietly obtained preservation order, Celeste's team pulled phone records from the night of the fire and found that Wade had called Marjorie 3 times in the hour surrounding the blaze. His final message, sent at 2:06 in the morning, contained only 4 words: "The dock is gone." Marjorie's reply came seconds later: "Begin the acquisition." Confident that the physical evidence was gone and Wade would take the fall. If anything surfaced, Marjorie called a special meeting to force through the annexation of Everett's land, insisting the transfer paperwork was already complete, and that he was simply delaying the inevitable handover. During the meeting, she displayed images of the burned dock and stated with total certainty that the fire had started at the northern electrical panel, a detail the fire department had never released to the public. Only someone who had stood on that dock before the flames spread wide could have known precisely where the fire began, and when Everett calmly asked how she happened to know that detail, Marjorie hesitated before claiming Wade had heard it, secondhand from a firefighter at the scene. Nolan, seated quietly in the back of the room, stood and stated plainly that he had never shared that information with Wade or with anyone connected to the association. The temperature of the room shifted instantly. Everett pressed further, asking why an invoice for accelerant fuel had been labeled with his own name and a restoration project code before the fire had even taken place. A question that visibly rattled Wade and forced Laurel to realize for the first time that Marjorie intended to let her absorb the financial blame entirely. Despite the mounting tension, Marjorie pushed the vote through anyway, securing an overwhelming majority, using a stack of proxy ballots that, as one resident soon discovered, bore her own signature, though she had never authorized anyone to cast a vote on her behalf. Several others checked their names against the tally and found the same forgery repeated across dozens of ballots. Rather than expose the fraud on the spot, Everett let the meeting continue and let Marjorie declare victory on camera, turning the falsified vote into public recorded evidence of exactly the kind Delaney would need later. After the meeting ended, Wade approached Everett quietly in the parking lot and admitted that Marjorie had ordered the fire, though he insisted he had only meant to damage part of the structure and never expected the flames to spread as far as they did. He offered information in exchange for Everett's promise not to pursue charges, a promise Everett told him honestly was not his to give. Wade walked away without realizing Celeste's team had recorded the entire exchange from a parked vehicle across the street. For Everett, watching Wade's shoulders sag as he crossed the parking lot was the first moment the case felt less like an abstract fight over paperwork and more like a slow unraveling of people who had convinced themselves loyalty to Marjorie would always be repaid. She had spent 3 sleepless nights weighing the risk of coming forward against the growing certainty that Marjorie intended to make her the fall guard the moment federal scrutiny arrived. And in the end, it was that certainty more than any sense of justice that pushed her to act. Laurel, shaken by what she had witnessed, sent Delaney an anonymous email containing a hidden spreadsheet from the association's financial system buried under a payment code labeled L24. The final line read simply, Lawson dock removal final payment upon transfer approved by Marjorie Voss. Sensing that Wade was wavering and might talk, Marjorie moved first, firing him publicly and telling residents he had embezzled funds, misused association vehicles, and was likely responsible for the fire himself, handing local police a prepared file that made Wade appear to be the sole authority behind the fuel purchases. Local officers briefly detained him, and for a moment it seemed Marjorie had successfully built her scapegoat. Celeste intervened, asking local authorities to hold off on formal charges, fearing that an early arrest would collapse the larger case before it could be fully built. Once Wade learned that Marjorie had already scrubbed his name from certain records and intended to let him absorb the entire blame, he agreed to cooperate fully. He revealed that on the night of the fire, Marjorie had stood on the far side of the lake watching through binoculars, calling the crew directly, and instructing them to cut the pump line before lighting anything. He also mentioned a second phone he had used exclusively to communicate with her. A phone that had vanished from its hiding place by the time federal agents arrived to retrieve it because Marjorie had already sent someone into his apartment hours earlier to remove it. Undeterred, Marjorie sought an emergency court order allowing the association to take control of Everett's land based on the falsified vote and the forged transfer agreement, and the judge granted limited safety measures, though not permitting new construction. Marjorie exploited that narrow window anyway, sending an excavator to the shoreline to begin clearing the remaining foundation of the dock. Everett stood in front of the machine holding a copy of the court order, refusing to move, but never raising his voice or his hands, simply pointing out that the order granted no authority for demolition. Marjorie arrived and ordered the operator to continue regardless, and as the excavator's bucket bit into the ground, it exposed a large drainage pipe buried beneath the old foundation, running directly from the maintenance building to the lake. Dark, chemical-smelling water poured out where the pipe had cracked, and Marjorie immediately demanded the hole be filled in before anyone could examine it further. Everett filmed everything. Residents who had gathered along the road that afternoon watched in stunned silence as the dark water spread across the exposed earth, several of them recalling aloud that the lake near the old outflow had smelled faintly unpleasant for years. A smell the association had always blamed on algae blooms. Whenever anyone asked, Celeste's technical team, already on site with federal authorization, collected samples from the pipe's opening and confirmed it likely represented an illegal discharge system the association had concealed for years, one that Everett's dock had simply happened to sit close enough to reveal. Burning the dock had accomplished two goals at once, destroying a structure that stood in the way of a lucrative land grab and clearing access to quietly bury the evidence of years of illegal dumping. Laboratory results soon confirmed that the chemical residue found beneath the dock matched a solvent purchased using the very federal grant money meant for stormwater upgrades. Celeste told Everett plainly that the case was no longer about arson alone. It now involved conspiracy, wire fraud, evidence destruction, and systemic pollution, a scope that reached far beyond anything a homeowners association dispute typically carried. With Laurel's cooperation secured, Celeste sought search warrants for the association office, the maintenance yard, Marjorie's home, and the 3 shell companies tied to the stolen grant funds, though her team held off executing them until they could locate where the original financial ledgers were being kept. Laurel admitted that Marjorie had directed her to sign off on dozens of falsified payments, describing them at the time as simple advances against the future shoreline development. When Laurel had pushed back, Marjorie threatened to expose old bookkeeping errors and let Laurel bear the full weight of any investigation alone. Wearing a hidden recording device provided by Celeste's team, Laurel met with Marjorie in the association office and raised her concerns about the fuel invoices possibly leading back to the fire. Marjorie answered coldly that no evidence remained and that Wade would take responsibility for everything, a statement that on its own tied her directly to a cover-up already in motion. When Laurel asked about the missing camera footage, Marjorie admitted that her people had retrieved the memory card from Everett's home themselves, linking her personally to both the arson and the break-in in a single sentence. Pressed further about the forged transfer agreement, Marjorie explained that the paperwork only needed to survive long enough for the resort company to release its deposit, after which the association's attorneys would drag out any lawsuit until Everett ran out of money to fight it. Celeste now had the confession she needed. But Marjorie noticed Laurel repeatedly touching her collar and, growing suspicious, tore the recording device from her clothing and locked the office door, threatening to make Laurel the public face of the entire fraud scheme. Laurel triggered a silent alarm on her phone, though Celeste held her team back briefly, wary that storming the building too soon might push Marjorie to destroy data remotely before it could be secured. Instead, Marjorie opened a safe, removed a hard drive and several folders, and carried them out to the garage. Across the street, Everett and Delaney were quietly preparing paperwork for what still appeared to be an ordinary civil hearing, when Everett noticed smoke rising from a metal drum behind the office building. Marjorie was burning the ledgers herself. She had waited weeks for this exact convergence of evidence: financial records, a cooperating witness, and a suspect actively destroying documents in real time, knowing that a single premature move could give a defense attorney grounds to argue the case had been rushed. Celeste gave the order to move. Federal vehicles closed off both ends of the street at once, and agents in tactical gear entered the office, the maintenance yard, and Marjorie's home simultaneously. When Marjorie turned around, Celeste was already standing behind her, informing her flatly that she had just destroyed evidence in an active federal investigation. Agents restrained Marjorie in front of a crowd of gathering residents while she insisted, still composed, that this was all a misunderstanding and that the association would sue the federal government for interference. Celeste read the initial charges. Aloud: conspiracy to commit arson, destruction of property for financial gain, wire fraud, embezzlement of federal grant funds, forgery of land records, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence illegal, discharge into protected waters, and witness intimidation. Marjorie was placed in handcuffs and led to a waiting vehicle. Wade was brought to the scene to help agents locate a hidden compartment built into the maintenance building's wall, where they found fuel drums matching the batch found at the dock, a scorched maintenance jacket, the original architectural plans for the yacht club, and an envelope containing the stolen memory card from Everett's home, the footage still perfectly intact. The recovered video showed Wade and two other crew members pouring fuel across the decking, and near the end of the clip, it captured Marjorie's car, parked on the far shore, followed by a second camera angle showing her stepping out, making a phone call, and watching the fire she had ordered begin to spread. Laurel provided the password to the financial hard drive, revealing that Marjorie had funneled more than $2,300,000 from association dues and federal grant funds into companies controlled by relatives, while the board had forged hundreds of ballots over the years to raise fees, approve favorable contracts, and quietly remove anyone who challenged her authority. 3 additional board members were arrested that same afternoon, along with 2 contractors connected to the maintenance yard, all led away in view of neighbors who had spent years too afraid to ask questions. Federal prosecutors moved immediately to freeze every association account, bar the entire board from further operation, appoint an independent court receiver, void the fraudulent fines and liens placed against residents, prevent any further destruction of records, and suspend every pending shoreline development contract. State regulators followed by revoking Cedar Ridge Estates' corporate standing altogether, citing systemic fraud and the absence of any lawful governing board left to operate it. The court confirmed once and for all that Everett's land had never belonged to the association, and the forged map and transfer agreement were declared void from the start. Residents watched as the association's sign was removed from the office building entirely, the door sealed behind a federal notice. As she was walked to the vehicle, Marjorie turned to Everett and told him this had all happened because he was selfish, unwilling to share the shoreline with the community he lived beside. Everett answered simply that she had never burned the dock for the community. She had burned it because it stood between her and the money she intended to steal. Marjorie had no answer for that. Before Everett left the scene, Celeste returned to him, the wrench bearing his father's initials recovered from the evidence room once its role in the investigation had been documented, along with the original memory card that had started everything. Everett looked out at the empty stretch of shoreline where the dock had once stood and said quietly that they had destroyed the structure, but they had never managed to burn away the truth. 6 months later, Marjorie faced a long list of federal charges while Wade pleaded guilty and cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. Laurel was granted leniency for providing the recording and financial records that broke the case open, though she still faced consequences for the forged signatures she had personally authorized under pressure. The remaining board members were either indicted or permanently barred from serving in any community governing role again. The hearing where those figures were finalized ran nearly the entire day, with Delaney walking the court through each invoice, each falsified record, and each month Everett had spent locked out of his own shoreline while Marjorie pursued her scheme. And by the time the judge read the final numbers, aloud, several jurors in an unrelated courtroom down the hall could be heard asking what all the commotion outside had been about. The court ordered Marjorie, her co-conspirators, and the associated insurance carriers to compensate Everett for the cost of rebuilding the dock, the value of the boat destroyed in the fire, the environmental damage caused by the illegal discharge, his legal expenses, the harm caused by the fire, break-in, and public defamation, and an additional penalty meant to serve as a deterrent to others who might consider similar schemes. Every fraudulent fine levied against residents over the years was erased, and every improper lien placed on their homes was formally dissolved. Cedar Ridge Estates was never permitted to reform under a new name. In its place, residents created a voluntary neighborhood association with no authority to fine, seize property, or interfere with land outside shared community spaces. Franklin Moss worked alongside several longtime residents to review 8 years of old financial records, uncovering dozens of families who had been forced to pay excessive fees, absorb unjust penalties, or sell their homes below market value under pressure from Marjorie's regime. One elderly widow near the north entrance who had quietly sold her home 2 years earlier, after facing relentless fines she never understood, was located by Franklin's outreach effort and included in the fund, despite having already moved out of state a small correction to an injustice that had gone unspoken for years. A restitution fund was established from the seized assets of Marjorie and her network of shell companies to help make those families whole again. Everett chose not to build anything extravagant on the site. He rebuilt the dock according to the original design, this time using fire-resistant lumber, an automatic suppression system, and independent cameras that answered to no one but him. He kept one blackened plank from the original structure, mounting it inside the tool shed in a glass case with his father's wrench displayed just beneath it. Building the new dock took the better part of a summer, and Everett insisted on doing much of the framing himself, the same way his father had taught him, measuring twice, cutting once, and pausing at the end of each day to sit on the half-finished decking and watch the light change over the porting the prosents. Water. Nolan attended the day the new dock was completed, arriving still in his work uniform after a shift at the station, and told Everett quietly that in all his years responding to fires, he had rarely seen a case end with the truth so completely intact. Delaney brought a certified copy of the final judgment, confirming permanently that the Lawson property belonged to no association, past or future. Celeste could not attend the small gathering, since parts of the broader investigation were still unfolding, but she sent a small plaque that read, "Simply built on truth, protected by evidence." Everett fastened it near the entrance of the new dock, where the morning light would catch it first. Franklin brought a small group of neighbors that same afternoon, people who had once crossed the street to avoid conversation, and now stood quietly at the edge of the yard, offering something closer to a wordless apology than a celebration. And Everett found he had no interest in holding it against them, understanding better than most how fear could quiet even good people for a long time. He shook hands, poured coffee for anyone who wanted it, and let the conversation drift toward ordinary things: the weather, the fish that had returned to the shallows now that the water ran clear again, small signs that the neighborhood was slowly remembering how to trust itself. One quiet afternoon at a place at a time. On the first evening after the new dock was finished, Everett sat alone at the edge of the deck, listening to the water move gently against the fresh pilings beneath him. A year earlier, the fire on that same stretch of water had convinced him he had lost the last thing tying him to his father. Now he understood that the memory had never lived in the boards themselves, but in the choice he had made to stand his ground, without becoming the kind of person who had tried to destroy him. Across the lake, the old association office remained dark and empty, its Cedar Ridge sign long since removed, leaving only a scatter of screw holes in the siding where it once hung. There were no more patrol trucks circling the neighborhood after midnight, no more threatening letters taped to mailboxes, no more fines mailed quietly to anyone who dared to ask a question out loud. Everett reached over and switched on the light at the head of the dock, and its clean white glow spread evenly across the water, replacing at last the memory of the fire that had once tried to take everything from him. In the end, Marjorie had believed that burning the dock would erase the boundary line she wanted to steal. Instead, the fire lit up every crime she had spent years hiding, and by the time the smoke finally cleared, the dock was gone, her entire board sat in handcuffs, and the association that had ruled the neighborhood through fear no longer existed at all.